Hello, Bill Scher.
Good morning, Matt K. Lewis.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone. We took a week off, and I miss you, Bill.
I miss you. I miss you too. I'd say I'm refreshed, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm disheveled and overtired as usual.
But I do feel
but
like
I did get.
I feel like absence does make the heart grow fonder. I almost had to call you just to talk,
Oh,
because we don't,
sweet.
this isn't like Wilbon and Kornheiser. I mean, I don't call you during Washington Wizards games to talk about. Can you believe what happened? We don't. This is usually when we talk, and I almost had to just do a random call. But in fairness, I don't.
It's like happened on the left that you needed an explainer for, and Fox didn't come through for you.
Yes, it wasn't just that. I mean, in fairness, I don't really call anybody, so it's not. There's nothing weird about us not. We would email. I mean, we're not barbarians here.
Well, I work out of the house. I'm not on the Beltway cocktail party circuit like you.
Yeah.
I'm not going to the White House Correspondents' Dinner this weekend. I'm in my forest bunker in the Northeast, and I just really don't talk to anybody all week. I have office calls. I have the kids. I have my wife. Really, that's about it on a given week. And even when I do talk to people, it usually isn't even about politics.
People are overrated. Let me just say that. Other people are hell. You don't need other people. So
you're what I have to make sure that my ideas aren't completely nuts.
I'm your lifeline as you slowly descend into madness, and I will simply reinforce everything you say and tell you that you're completely making sense as you spiral into Ralph Nader.
So for my weekly dose of sanity, in fact, I thought I had the one of the best doses of sanity in the whole Cliven Bundy nonsense. When you called out fellow conservatives, essentially for wishing for some bloodlust, it seemed. Hoping that Cliven Bundy would end up, a martyr at the hands of the jackbooted thugs of the federal government. I thought that was a pretty courageous piece that you wrote.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Believe it or not, Esquire on their blog chose to somehow attack me for being intellectually honest on this story. It's unclear.
I saw the post. That post was by Charles Pierce, and Charles Pierce, I love Charles Pierce. I think he's a fantastic writer. I thought he just didn't get what you were doing.
Yeah.
Or didn't really get your background.
He's not alone. But no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go on.
Well,
I understand why you were peeved, but I just think you misinterpreted what you were trying to say.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, when I write, I'm not right. I don't write trying to gain the approval of the mainstream, media. But if I did, this would have demonstrated what a fool's errand it is for a conservative to write something to try to be accepted. Because I can't imagine that anything I would have written should have gained more acceptance amongst the Esquire folks than this, and they still found a way to attack me for it. So clearly,
but you're basically saying that because you were trying to analyze why conservatives are so quickly attracted to folks like Bundy without really doing a vet, where he's coming from or what his full philosophy is. Obviously, people didn't know he had these views about race going into this, and didn't start to think that maybe he might have something wacky going on upstairs. And your suggestion was that people were sort of quick to embrace it because they wanted an armed standoff with the federal government. They wanted the federal government to overstep. And even if they wouldn't say this publicly or believe it literally, that a part of them would want Bundy to be literally martyred to make the argument that the federal government is out of control. Am I fairly characterizing your argument?
Not exactly, but you're very, very close. So first of all, let me say I think there are a lot of reasons why conservatives embrace Cliven Bundy, and the left does this too. They did it with Rodney King. They did it with Cindy Sheehan. Conservatives do it with Cliven Bundy and Ted Nugent, and it's the enemy of the enemy is my friend thing. It's a rush to sort of embrace somebody who's like a victim of the other side, whether or not they're deserving or vetted, and to sort of build this person up, this everyman, Joe the plumber. There's another example of conservatives doing it, to build somebody up as a folk hero who isn't necessarily deserving in their own rights, but sort of as a symbol and as a victim. And I think that's very dangerous. So I think there are a lot of reasons why they did it. Now, what you're alluding to is something that, frankly, I do think I was maybe the only person to make this point. And it's not so much that I think there were certain people like Sean Hannity and probably some other talk radio hosts. It's not that they were rooting necessarily, although some might have been. But it's not that they were rooting for Cliven Bundy to be martyred. But it's that I think that they saw this through the prism of Ruby Ridge and the Branch Davidian and the Elian Gonzalez seizure, and that they essentially assumed that the way this thing was going to play out was the same way that it played out in the 90s when there was a lot of government overreach and I would argue the government acting rashly and irresponsibly. I mean, there were similarities, I mean, the Branch Davidians and the Ruby Ridge, the Weavers were heavily armed. And the government, really, I think, overextended and did some, probably horrific things, even though these people were by no means heroes. And I think the right sort of built, some on the right built these victims up as heroic, which is easier to do because dead men tell no tales. And if someone is dead, it's easier to make them a martyr. Now, the funny thing is, President Obama, I think he was in the Philippines or something, and he was asked about the Donald Sterling situation, right? This owner of the Clippers. And President Obama said something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of, when you have ignorant people, the best thing you can do is just give them time and let them run their mouth, and eventually they will destroy themselves. And I would say that unlike Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush's, administrations and Janet Reno and all that, Barack Obama pulled back. And I think he gave Cliven Bundy enough time to essentially hang himself. And when he did that, it tainted all the conservatives who were sort of building him up as this folk hero, and who some of whom I think assumed he might go out in a blaze of glory, like Ruby Ridge.
I generally agree with you that I think the federal government has handled this appropriately delicately. I don't necessarily agree with the critique of what happened in the 90s, but obviously with evidence of what has transpired before, there was a sense that, let's not. We don't need a bloody standoff here. We know how these things can go. Let's find a way to lower the temperature. I agree with that, but let's also note they don't have their grazing fees yet. They haven't resolved the standoff. They still have to find a way to get the money that they've been owed for 20 years. But the other part of this that I think is interesting from how this affects the conservative movement. I had written a piece for your esteemed publication, The Daily Caller, giving advice to conservatives on how to get more street cred when it comes to talking about poverty, and the top of the list was to start going after racists and stop reflexively defending racist comments on grounds of championing political incorrectness. And it seemed like in the Bundy case, as soon as he made those comments, granted they were so beyond the pale, they were hard to defend.
And on tape.
And on tape, there's really no quibbling about context. The full context was there. Everyone up to Reince Priebus and Rand Paul dumping on the guy,
and Sean Hannity. I mean, we should note, because I have been critical of Hannity, that Hannity immediately called these comments racist and condemned them.
Right now, is the same thing happening with Sterling on the right, or is there more qualification going on. I feel like there have been a couple of pieces I've read where there's been more attacking Stiviano and the circumstances of the taping and uh, that kind of nuanced defense, and not the same kind of pile on that we got with the Bundy situation. But I've only caught little bits of here and there. You might have a different perspective on it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think first conservatives are very quick to distance themselves from Bundy because it would have been so easy to attach Bundy to them, based on the fact that that conservative media had essentially built him up and lionized him. So it was a matter of self-preservation. Now, in the case of Sterling, I would say that the vast majority of conservatives are essentially in the same place where they have condemned his remarks. I do think that there are some interesting points to be made, though. Even if one concedes that Sterling, what he said was horrible, and I'm sure he's a horrible person. And frankly, the NBA, I mean, if their constitution allows them to, they have a right, I would say, to decide what type of people that they want to associate with and that they want to represent them as owners. So I don't have any problem with them banning him for life. But having said that, I do think this does raise some sort of ancillary issues and questions. One thing is, we've talked about this before, Bill, everything is taped now. Everywhere you go, everything is taped. And some conservatives have said, well, if Linda Tripp or James O'Keefe had taped Donald Sterling, that's the only thing that might have saved him, And I think it's a fair point. I mean, and the other thing, you've had people like Mark Cuban, the owner of, I think, the San Antonio Spurs, maybe it's Dallas, I don't know. Famous, he's sort of a libertarian guy, and he has sort of talked about this slippery slope where, look, okay, you want to ban this guy for being a racist. I think we can all agree that's, unacceptable. What about the homophobes? What about someone who doesn't like a certain religion? I mean, where does it stop? And while I have to say, as someone who defended Phil Robertson and the Duck Dynasty thing, that is not...
And there's also the Ike situation in Mozilla.
Right. Yes. Good point. And I think Andrew Sullivan and I continue to be on the same wavelength in both of these cases. But so I am sympathetic to the argument that people should be allowed to have unpopular and even wrong opinions and not to be persecuted. I think, again, this is a little different for a variety of reasons, including I would say I think that race is a special circumstance. I think, slavery is America's original sin, and I think that because of our nation's history and that this specific issue dealing with race relations, I basically have a zero tolerance policy toward it, and I really don't have any sympathy toward someone like him, like Sterling. So, life gets messy and complex, and maybe there are some double standards that arise. But to answer your question, Bill, I think there are some sort of academic, intellectual, esoteric defenses of Sterling, but I don't see a whole lot of conservatives rushing in to defend this man.
So that you're not seeing that Howard Ike free speech argument being articulated widely right now.
No, I think, again, Mark Cuban is probably the most prominent person who's raised this issue, and he's not a conservative by any means. He's probably a libertarian-leaning liberal. I have seen some people who basically say, Donald Sterling's horrible, and I'm glad he's being ousted, but if James O'Keefe or Linda Tripp had taped him, that would have been the only thing that would have saved him. There are some other people, like Mark Ambinder at The Week, who are basically, saying something which I disagree with, another sort of ancillary issue here that Ambener, if you go read his piece at The Week, says that Spike Lee's racism is forgivable because conservatives are bad people, essentially. And I don't buy that Donald Sterling was a conservative anyway, but somehow he's saying that these double standards are okay, that if a liberal's racist, that's okay because they mean well. But if conservatives show any sign of this, then we have to really take it very seriously because their policies are meant to hurt people. I really do like Mark Ambener, but I think one standard will do just fine, as George Carlin has said.
Well, I wouldn't call Spike Lee a racist. I don't think that's just an assertion one can make.
You know what? I'd have to go back and dig. I was just reading this Ambener piece, but presumably there are things that Spike Lee has said or done that may call that into question. I should have researched it. He certainly said controversial things. I know people have made that argument before. And I'm not saying you can't try to make the argument. But I think it's far from like a clear-cut thing where everyone agrees Spike Lee is a racist. I would say this: the problem is that when something like the Donald Sterling thing happens, if you start talking about, but Spike Lee, or but Linda Tripp, it sort of gives the impression that you that you're trying to divert or change the subject. And the Donald Sterling thing is deserving of being covered, and I have no sympathy for the devil in this regard. And I also, isn't it bizarre that if you were somebody who didn't like black people, that you would decide to go into the NBA business? It's such a weird story. So it has a lot of legs.
Well, and I think there's also lots of factors here, which, I feel like every time these situations come up, people pluck out a random thing that somebody else said that, maybe raised an eyebrow. For example, when Cliven Bundy said his comment about let me tell you one more thing I know about the Negro. Maybe they were better off when they were slaves. People say, well, Harry Reid said Negro once.
Yeah.
Well, that really wasn't the same thing. He said the word, yes, but he wasn't articulating the belief that perhaps they were better when they were slaves. That's sort of a key part of the statement that's relevant. And in the case of Sterling, look, let me give you another parallel. Jimmy the Greek. Jimmy the Greek got fired, 30 years ago.
For those too young to know what we're talking about, there's actually an ESPN 30 for 30 about Jimmy the Greek that you could, you could watch. Yeah.
And he was on videotape giving this cockamamie theory about why blacks are successful in sports because of the way they were bred when their ancestors were slaves. It was stupid. It was obviously wrong. But I would also note he seemingly was saying this at a restaurant while he was drunk, and so it's like a camera in his
fairness,
face.
I think he was drunk most of the time.
Right. And it wasn't a part of a pattern of demeaning blacks, demeaning black athletes. Who knows how deep-seated his feelings were? In the case of Sterling, not only did he say something truly awful, he was trying to impose his beliefs on his girlfriend and dictate her behavior. And on top of that, he had a pattern of actively discriminating against real people, like housing discrimination, denying people housing. So it's not just a stray comment by a doddering old man. This guy has a decades-long pattern of discrimination in his business practices that made, I think, a lot easier to say. This is not just a one-off comment that someone said, when he was popping off at a bar one day. This guy is an actively bad person who is a bad representation of the NBA. We have provisions in our Constitution to deal with situations like this, and we have the right to use them.
So, a few things. One, I watched that Jimmy the Greek 30 for 30 special recently, a year ago maybe. I don't remember if he had a history of racism. He was certainly a sexist. And
What do you expect? It was the 80s.
His colleague, one of his colleagues, who was on air with him, he was essentially a sexual harasser, allegedly. So there's that, but for what that's worth.
It's worth a lot. If it was the kind of situation where a lot of people inside knew that and didn't quite know how to deal with it, and this gave them the excuse to deal with it.
At some point, I think she wouldn't even be on the set with them. I mean,
right. I mean,
they would have to.
That is a very substantive reason to try to find any excuse you can to get rid of the guy.
Yeah. So be that as it may, and of course there is a sports connection with the two of them. The other thing that was so interesting about Sterling was the whole, you can have sex with these people. I'm cool with that. But don't bring them to my games. And for God's sakes, no Instagram. It's a bizarre story. I will say, Jazz Shaw at Hot Air posited a couple interesting theories that I also wrote about. One is that Sterling and Bundy have a certain age in common. They're men of a certain age, and that there may be a generational component to this, which would be good news because it means some of this would die off due to attrition eventually. But the other thing that Jazz Shaw at Hot Air raised, which I think is true, is that both of these men, Cliven Bundy and Donald Sterling, were in their own way isolated. Cliven Bundy as a rancher sort of was isolated from, political correctness. And it's easy to understand how, how he could be sort of cut off from a lot of the progress that has happened in this country over time, just by virtue of being geographically isolated. Now, Donald Sterling was isolated because of his money, because it allowed him to be cloistered, because nobody tells rich old men to shut the hell up or that you're not funny, because rich old men have a lot of yes men around them, and if there's a problem, they can buy it off. Donald Sterling was about to be honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the NAACP because he gives them money. So
right.
I would argue that having money allowed him, because if you or I held these attitudes, harbored these racist attitudes, we would probably be without a job. But I would argue that his money probably allowed him to sort of allow these things to fester. So that's an interesting point. They're both. I do think there's similarities between these two men, and these stories really converged. And I think Sean Hannity and Cliven Bundy probably owe Donald Sterling some thanks for knocking them off the front page.
Now, another story that I saw got your attention this week was Robert Costa's piece in the Washington Post catching up with Sarah Palin, and his conclusion after seeing a kind of poor turnout for an Iowa rally was to suggest that her star in the Republican Party has dimmed, and you proceeded to suggest that the Costa piece has now made it permissible in the conservative movement to criticize Palin without being deemed a heretic or a rhino.
It's a theory. That it created a sort of a permission structure. I mean, first I can tell you, as someone who's written very favorably and unfavorably about Sarah Palin, that
a whole book on Sarah Palin.
I edited a book of her quotes. So, but anyway,
it's a book and it has your name on it.
That is true, and I would argue that it was mostly positive. I mean, if you actually, this is a woman who had an 88% approval rating as governor of Alaska. I think she was quite different as governor, and I think that some of the attacks and the criticism sort of radicalized her and changed her. But so anyway, when I wrote that book, when I edited that book, because it's her words mostly, I wrote like the foreword. When I edited that book, a lot of it was her words were surprisingly eloquent, and that was sort of the point of it. I think she should have been happy with it. But since then, I've written favorably and unfavorably about her, and I can tell you that there is a price to be paid for writing unfavorably about her, and it's mainly dealing with a bunch of people who troll you and write horrible things about you if you do it. And so I think that over time, now Sarah Palin, interestingly, helped create a generation of competitors, people that she endorsed, like Ted Cruz, who are now sort of stealing her thunder. And so, it's a matter of accretion. Tipping points. The whole concept of a tipping point is that you don't see the sort of accretion. It's just all of a sudden the dam breaks, and it's all of a sudden now okay. The world has changed, and one gets the sense that all of a sudden it's okay for conservatives to criticize Sarah Palin. And I was really surprised when she made this comment at the NRA. She made this comment about waterboarding is how we baptize terrorists, and there were a ton of conservatives who were publicly criticizing her on Twitter and in other places for this, and that struck me as surprising. I had not seen that. There'd be the occasional person who would sort of poke their head up, and it was a whack-a-mole thing. But this was a lot of people sort of unafraid to publicly criticize Sarah Palin, people from all sorts of conservative center-right outlets. And it sort of happened around the same time as this Robert Costa piece came out. And I don't know if it's if I'm sort of correlation and causation or what, but the fact that it does seem that her power has been to some degree diminished, and people are finally getting the memo.
I think for those on the left, our attitude is, what took you so long? This person obviously was not going to be the intellectual powerhouse of the Republican Party, but. Is this a sign of maturity? Okay, maybe it's not such a good idea to have these two-dimensional right-wing caricatures be what people see of the Republican Party, or is it just that her shelf life is over and you move on to a Rand Paul or a Mike Huckabee who also do similar stunts to get media attention, and not that. Okay, let's now look for more sober governors like John Kasich or Brian Sandoval to lift up and show that we know how to govern.
I mean, I would like to say it's maturity, but I honestly just think it's that her shelf life. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't want to suggest that she's over. She's still a very significant force, but not what she was, and certainly not what she might have been. And I think that it's the fear is gone. There was a fear. I mean, I'm telling you, Bill. I mean, look, it didn't bother me too much. Because I basically write whatever and take a lot of crap for what I say and write. But there was a disincentive to writing things about her, because you knew that. I mean, first of all, if you're a conservative pundit or writer, you have a base. And your base is her base, except they love her more than you. And so it's just not a smart career move to piss off the people who pay you, who put you on TV or whatever. And then there's just the fact of, like, if I write this, how many emails am I going to get? How many people am I going to have to block on Twitter? And, she was attacked unfairly by the left, and do I want to pick on the girl? Do I want to be accused of aiding and abetting the enemy? I mean, just, like, it was really a bad idea. I mean, it had consequences to, and the worst part is, it wasn't just, you could write a piece that said, I like Sarah Palin, I think she's a force for good, but I think she was wrong about this blood libel thing. And that alone would have, elicited all sorts of negative stimuli. So I feel like we may have reached a point now where, based on what I'm seeing, 6 years later, where it's like acceptable that you can be a conservative criticize her and not sort of lose your conservative card.
Now, another issue that came up this week on the Democratic side of the pond is these recordings of John Kerry, Secretary of State John Kerry, speaking to the Trilateral Commission, a great source of conspiracy theories. Reporter Josh Rogan for the Daily Beast probably slipped in with a tape recorder unknown. It was supposed to be an off-the-record private session.
Speaking of people taping things, I mean, is this not a trend in our modern society of private meetings? And you know, we saw it with Mitch McConnell had somebody stand outside his office with a tape recorder taping a private campaign meeting.
This is old school. This is Watergate. You know, secret recordings. That's I wouldn't call that a technological advancement.
Yeah, and it's probably, you know, it's damn good reporting. So anyway,
I guess your recording equipment is smaller these days, more portable.
Yeah.
So and just so folks know, if they haven't heard this is the full quote that was said. He's talking about Israel, how Israel should be more amenable to a peace agreement with the Palestinians. Quote, a two-state solution will be clearly underscored as the only real alternative, because a unitary state winds up either being an apartheid state with second-class citizens, or it ends up being a state that destroys the capacity of Israel to be a Jewish state. So this is different than what Jimmy Carter did in his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, where, one, he's saying it very publicly on the cover of a book, not in a private session, and two, Carter was saying that the state of Israel now is apartheid. Kerry is saying you're going to end up this way, not by your choice, whether you like it or not, if you don't do a deal, because demographically, there's only two outcomes. Either because more and more Palestinians get born, they eventually become a majority of your population, and the only way you can continue to control your country is either by making this majority class second class in terms of rights, or you're no longer a Jewish state anymore. I mean, that's just math. So he wasn't accusing the current leadership of actively desiring and actively executing a form of apartheid. Others do, mind you, but Kerry was not. But when he used the word came out, everyone got all huffy. Kerry had to release a clarifying statement, and now you have a Politico article saying, name one high-profile foreign policy situation is Kerry handling well right now. You can't name any, which is really not true. Actually, the Iran peace talks are going pretty well so far. There's been lots of reports saying that they're on a decent track. But obviously the media perception is now sort of Kerry under fire. And you know, when the Iran deal was first struck, some people, myself included, said, hey, maybe Kerry is proving to be a better Secretary of State than Hillary Clinton was, because he is being more active on these fronts and putting more on the line, more personal capital on the line to try to solve these extremely intractable problems. Now, of course, putting himself on the line, having things not go perfectly well in various areas, he's now taking it on the chin. But I would argue that is the risk you have to take if you ever want to do great things. And if his batting average ends up being, 1 out of 5, and he only gets Iran, that's still pretty good in the world of peace agreements, major peace agreements. So I feel a lot of this blowback is small-minded.
Well, speaking of his batting average, Maureen Dowd's column today talks about how Barack Obama, ran as Babe Ruth, but is now just trying to hit singles. One does get the sense that John Kerry's trying to hit home runs, and maybe he should be up there trying to slap a single or a double when it comes to Israel. But I do want to raise the question, there's a media angle here that you alluded to, Bill, and that is that it seems like the media framed this story as John Kerry calling Israel an apartheid state. And I think that's an interesting thing to discuss. First, let me ask you, I mean, who's to blame? Did the Daily Beast, did Josh Rogan, did Fox News, who framed the story based on this quote?
I mean, the headline of the Rogan piece is not an unfair headline. Kerry warns Israel could become an apartheid state. That is not a mischaracterization of what he said. You could argue that just making that one quote a story was sort of overly breathless and lends itself to misinterpretation. But the actual words that Josh Rogan wrote were not inaccurate. It's like everyone has taken that. I don't know if it's Fox. I mean, I've seen quotes of various politicians. I haven't watched enough Fox to know how they've handled it. But certainly, just simply to oversimplify and say Kerry called Israel an apartheid state just is not accurately characterized the quote.
Well, I mean, that's sort of the takeaway. I mean, am I misrepresenting it, or is that essentially the gist of the? Is that the takeaway that most of us have taken away from this story?
Yeah, I think, and in Kerry's clarifying statement, some would say he backed off. I don't think it's quite right, but he pointed out in it that there are plenty of people in Israel, plenty of Israeli political leaders that say the same exact stuff. It's not like he is introducing this radical concept. Everybody in Israel knows this is a risk. It's one of the reasons why Netanyahu doesn't just totally walk away from everything, because there are these demographic pressures that just won't go away. So I think he was just being a little blunt about it in a private session, which... private session. It's really not. You could maybe argue that if Kerry was touring the world in press conferences, constantly making the comparison, that would be sort of unfairly loaded for a diplomat being an honest broker to do. I can see someone making that case, but to say it privately, something that is said pretty commonly in Israel, doesn't strike me as being a gaffe of any sort.
Well, the media thing is interesting to me because there was a piece last Sunday on, I think it was Meet the Press. David Brooks said something about Barack Obama, that there's a perception in the Middle East that he's not manly enough. And Brooks really prefaced this with, I don't think it's true, but he does have I'm going to put it bluntly, I'm going to put it crudely, a manhood problem. I don't think it's true, but and so he really did preface it. There were a lot of caveats, and the headline was, David Brooks says Barack Obama has a manhood problem.
Right, which I agree with you, wasn't a fair characterization of the comment. I mean, he was basically saying Obama has a perception problem of this sort.
Yeah, but dude,
and saying that it wasn't really deserved.
But I write stuff all the time, and I tweet stuff, and I need headlines, and you want to get clicks. And a headline that says David Brooks thinks it's possible that Obama might possibly be perceived, it just doesn't work. So my point is that it's like a don't hate the player, hate the game situation, where we've essentially our media incentives are to simplify and misrepresent things and to make them hooky and sexier than maybe they are. And then the problem is, when it comes to something with like international implications, that could have real consequences.
I want to get back to that Maureen Dowd column, because I think, if people haven't seen the video, Obama gave this extended commentary at a press conference in the Philippines, where he was defending his foreign policy writ large. It was actually a response to a question from Ed Henry at Fox News, asking him to define his Obama doctrine, and to respond to critics of his foreign policy. And Obama had said, most of these folks, who were criticizing me, just want me to, go in headlong militarily everywhere. And he said that often isn't a very good idea. And he goes on to say that his foreign policy avoids errors. You hit singles, you hit doubles. Every once in a while, we may be able to hit a home run, but we steadily advance the interest of the American people and our partnership with folks around the world. Now, I haven't read the whole Maureen Dowd column because I've given up on Maureen Dowd a long time ago. I decided it was not important to my day to read her.
Kind of amazing. I think she has a Pulitzer Prize, which I could be wrong, but anyway.
So forgive me if I'm not characterizing what she says properly. But, she seems to be suggesting that Obama's given up on the lofty goals of the 2008 campaign, which the mere hiring of John Kerry to do all this diplomatic work, undermines that. Now, they obviously still try for home runs, but you can try for home runs with the understanding you're not often always going to get home runs. I mean, Babe Ruth didn't bat 1,000 home runs. Sometimes he hit singles, and he struck out a lot too. Yes, but you still respect the player that he doesn't hit every single ball out of the park. Let me just say, as an Oriole fan, the fact that she references Earl Weaver in that column, she had me at Earl Weaver. So I think it was terrific, and I will hear nothing bad said about her now. But I think what's sort of interesting about Obama's foreign policy is, even when he is swinging for the fences, I do think the attempt at least is to do it in a way where if you do miss, that you don't have a massive backlash, that you don't necessarily make things worse in the process, and the hesitation with let's invade Syria no matter what. Let's just go all in on Ukraine and have a proxy war with Russia. Maybe that kind of home run would have some consequences if it didn't work out quite right. Well, if you want to overextend the baseball metaphor, Bill, Bryce Harper was not hustling for the Washington Nationals, and so their manager benched him because he wasn't running out, plays at first. And I praised the manager for this leadership move, for benching him, Bryce Harper, for not hustling. A couple games later, Bryce Harper hustles, dives into third base head first, and sprains his thumb or something. Sometimes being overly aggressive is not doesn't work out as well, right? Right. There's risks in any action. There's risks in inaction. There's nothing that's going to go perfectly all the time. I find it generally strange, though, that any time a diplomat tries to strike a peace deal and it doesn't work out, it is somehow treated as a bad thing to have tried to do. When it's obviously a low probability endeavor to go. But why not try? And you have we talked about this in the past shows. Look, if the Iran deal works out, that was a pretty low probability endeavor, but would have a pretty big payoff if it works out. If you treated Russia as I think there is a fair argument. I'm not an expert on that. I think there's a fair argument that John Kerry could really be hitting some singles with the Israeli-Palestinian thing, and that he's swinging for the fences, and because home run hitters get some glory, and they're remembered by history, and so anyway, I think that's a fair criticism, if true. I'll give you the last word because I have to run. But I love running out the clock on you, Bill. That's my strategy. Just filibuster till. That's what I missed about you last week. No one ran the clock out on me last week. That's right. That's not the strategy my kids use on me. It works. I believe. I once worked for a guy who won every internal political argument by boring people to death, and eventually your bladder could I would have signed away the deed to my house for these meetings to end. So he won every internal argument. I thought that was the John Kerry strategy. It may be. Always good to talk to you. We'll talk next week. You got it. Until then, we'll see you here in the DMZ. See ya.